Welcome to Old North Church, one of America's most important historic icons. Its official name is Christ Church in the city of Boston. It was here that the American Revolution began. After Bostonians dumped the tea in the harbor in December of 1773, the town of Boston became a place full of tension. Parliament reacted to the Tea Party by abrogating many of the rights and liberties that Bostonians had long cherished. And then they sent a military man, a general, to be the governor of the province. The people of Boston and Massachusetts reacted to defend their rights. They established their own government. They called it the Provincial Congress. It met out in the town of Concord and elected as its leader John Hancock to be their president. They began to collect arms to defend themselves in case the British troops should try to leave Boston. Here within the town, British authority was collapsing. The royal governor was under pressure to do something. The Sons of Liberty were ready to resist. And so they had a plan. The plan was that if ever the British troops did leave Boston, the alarm would be sent out to all of the communities surrounding the town for the men to rise and take their muskets to defend their rights against the redcoats. On the evening of April the 18th, 1775, the town was alive. British troops were gathering down at the edge of the water. Everyone knew, they could see, that these troops were preparing to march. Spies told the Sons of Liberty that the British troops were preparing to march to Concord. They were going to Concord to seize the munitions that the Americans had been gathering. This was the moment when the plan came into effect. Paul Revere, perhaps Boston's best craftsman, a silversmith whose manufactures were elegant. It was Revere who was the patriot messenger. It was to be his assignment that when called upon to ride into the countryside to warn the British soldiers. There came a tap on Revere's door, North Square. Revere opened the door, and there stood a messenger from the Sons of Liberty to tell Mr. Revere, "The troops are marching tonight. They're on their way to Lexington and to Concord. You must ride to warn the countryside." While Revere prepared to leave, in the meantime, another plan began to unfold. There had been concern, of course, that Mr. Revere might not be able to make it out of the town or even into the countryside. He might be captured, intercepted by the redcoats. And so the plan was to warn the people on the other side of the river, the people in Charlestown, that the British were coming. In the 18th century, there were only two ways to leave the town of Boston. You could go by land, that is along a long neck of land, or you could go by sea, that is across the river. And so the plan was that if the British left by land, one lantern would be displayed in the belfry of the Old North Church. If, on the other hand, the British would cross the river and land in Charlestown, taking a different route, then the signal would be two lanterns. One if by land, two if by sea. As Revere was preparing to cross the river to Charlestown, here in this church, two men came into the darkness, Robert Newman and Captain Pulling. According to the plan, they now knew that the redcoats were going to cross the river and march on to Concord. And so the signal would be two lanterns. Carefully, these two men climbed the nearly 15-story high belfry, each of them carrying a lantern. And there in the window at the very top, they displayed the two lanterns, only for a brief moment. They certainly did not want the British to see the signal. The display was made, two lanterns. The British were marching, and they were coming by sea. In the meantime, Revere was being rowed across the Charles River underneath the stern of the British man-o'-war Somerset. He landed in Charlestown and took horse and immediately began to ride and ride and ride out through Medford, Cambridge, towards Lexington, towards Concord. En route, he did not cry out, "The British are coming, the British are coming." That would have seemed rather silly. After all, we were all British. As Revere rode through the countryside to warn of the advance of the British troops, the plan, another part of it, began to unfold. For he was not the only rider. Others now began to ride through the countryside as well to spread the alarm. He made it to Lexington, and there in Lexington he went to the Hancock Clark House, where John Hancock and Samuel Adams were staying. As he rode up to the Hancock Clark House, the guard warned him, "Be quiet, be quiet. You'll wake up Mr. Hancock and Mr. Adams." "They'll have reason enough to wake up," was Revere's response. He warned Hancock and Adams that the British were coming. He waited for a few moments, and then he was joined by William Dawes, another post rider who had been sent out from Boston to warn the countryside. And then together, Mr. Dawes and Mr. Revere began to ride towards Concord. As they made their way towards Concord, they encountered a third man, Dr. Prescott. And Dr. Prescott had been in Lexington on a late-night date with his girlfriend, and he was on his way home to Concord. He persuaded Mr. Revere and Mr. Dawes that he was a high son of liberty, and so together the three men rode. Prescott, living in the neighborhood, knew the countryside. Revere and Dawes were less acquainted. As they rode towards Concord, they encountered a British patrol that had been set out in advance. Dawes and Revere were captured. Prescott leaped across a stone wall, rode through the fields, and made it all the way to Concord. In the meantime, Revere and Dawes were being interrogated by the British soldiers. They told them that the whole countryside was alarmed, and after a while, the soldiers let those two men go to ride back to warn the British who were coming towards Lexington that their secret trip, their secret march, was hardly a secret anymore. As the British came up the road towards Lexington, in the town itself, Captain John Parker, the commander of the town's militia, summoned his militia company. They stood on Lexington Green awaiting the arrival of the British. Well, they didn't come. It was dark and it was cold. And so Parker told his men to stand down. He would call them when the British were announced, when they finally arrived. He told them that he would call them by the sound of the drum. And so they retired to a local tavern, to their homes to await. About dawn, the announcement came that the British indeed had been spotted at the south end of the town. Parker immediately summoned the young William Diamond, the drummer boy, to sound the alarm. The militia gathered again on Lexington Green. They were standing off to the side of the green. They were not standing in the road. Indeed, they were not standing in any way that would have blocked the advance of the British soldiers. As the British soldiers came close to the Americans, Parker was telling his men, "Stand your ground, stand your ground." As the British approached, there was at the very tip of the diamond shape, of the triangular-shaped Lexington Green, at the very tip there was a small building. For one brief moment, the officers leading the British contingent and the enlisted men were separated. In the meantime, the British officers are yelling at the Americans, "Put down your arms, put down your arms." And Parker is telling them, "Stand fast, stand fast." A moment of high tension, of confusion. People were scared. It was at that moment when the British soldiers were, for such a brief moment, separated from their officers, that a shot rang out. To this day, we don't know who fired that shot. But in this moment, when the British soldiers heard that shot, without their officers being present to lead them, they lowered their muskets with bayonets and advanced towards the Americans, and opened fire. When the smoke cleared, several Americans were dead. Others were wounded. By this time, the British officers had regained control of their men, formed them up, and began the march on to the town of Concord. As they approached Concord, since it was no secret anymore, the colonel in command ordered the band to begin to play. Flags unfurled, band playing now, they advanced towards Concord. The Concord militia by this time had also been alerted and warned, and they too had been gathering. Men from the town of Concord and Acton, Sudbury, had gathered nearby at a place called Punkatassett Hill. It was the prearranged militia gathering place. There, several hundred men had gathered to wait, not knowing what was happening. When the British arrived in the center of Concord, the colonel in command immediately dispatched 2 small contingents to control the bridges that crossed the Concord River leading into the town of Concord. One of them, North Bridge. The soldiers went to North Bridge, and some soldiers went beyond North Bridge onto a farm looking for munitions that might be hidden there. In the meantime, the American militia moved from Punkatassett Hill down closer to the town. They wanted to see what was happening. As they came to a small hill overlooking the North Bridge, the Americans looked and saw rising from the town smoke. They thought that the British were burning their homes. The British were not. They were burning some of the munitions that they had found, gun carriages. But the men from Concord and Acton thought their homes were being destroyed. They began to come down off the hill towards the bridge. As they came towards the bridge, the British soldiers defending the bridge warned them, "Stay back, stay back, stay back." They began to tear up the bridge. That, of course, was destroying public property, something the Concordians could not stand. And so they continued down the hill. As they came close to the bridge, the British soldiers leveled their muskets and fired. As they fired, the American colonel in command is supposed to have leaped in the air, crying out, "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sakes, fire." At that moment, the first casualty at the bridge went down. His name from the town of Acton, Isaac Davis. When the smoke cleared from this brief engagement, the British soldiers, greatly outnumbered, retreated from the bridge. They went back into the town of Concord. The Americans didn't know what to do. They had just fired on the king's troops. They had fired on the king's troops. They stood and waited. In the meantime, the British soldiers who had been on the other side of the bridge marched down the road and went across the bridge. The Americans did not try to stop them. By noon, all of the British had gathered back in the town of Concord to prepare for their march back to Boston, a distance of about 18 miles. They left the center of town and marched back on the same route by which they had come out. When they got east of the town, about a mile, they came to a place called Miriam's Corner. There at Miriam's Corner, they encountered militia coming from the town of Reading. There at Miriam's Corner, they fired upon one another. From that place, Miriam's Corner, all the way back to Boston, would for the rest of this sad day be one long running fight. By the time the British got back to Lexington, they were bedraggled, tired. They had lost many, many men, and many more were wounded. They were, in fact, on the verge of surrender. But it was at that point that a relief column arrived from Boston and saved the day for the British. The relief column married up with the bedraggled British who had suffered at the battles, and together they marched back to Boston, through the town of Monotamy, now called Arlington. And when they came into Cambridge, they decided not to try to cross the Charles there, but to turn and go to Charlestown. And so they marched to Charlestown. There they rested. They took up arms and prepared to defend themselves from an American attack, which did not happen. By the evening of the April 19th, 1775, this engagement was over. More than 200 British soldiers had been wounded or killed, and about half that number Americans. The war had begun. What had thus far been protest, dumping tea in the harbor, boycotts, broadsides, speeches, was now an open revolution. The American cause had begun. The events of April 18th, April 19th, 1775 are part of a vivid memory of American history. It has always been remembered by Americans. We first had a great celebration in 1825, the 50th anniversary of the battles. It was at that event on Lexington Green in 1825 that a few of the old tottering veterans were brought out, men who had been there at Lexington and later at Concord. Someone asked one of the veterans, "What did Captain Parker say when you were standing here awaiting the British?" And the veteran remembered so vividly, he said, "The captain told us, stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, then let it begin here." Thus begins the story, the remembrance of our revolution. And then, in the 1830s, the town of Concord wanted to remember what happened at its bridge. You see, there's always been a little bit of competition between Lexington and Concord as to where the revolution began. But in the 1830s, the townsmen of Concord enlisted their most famous citizen to remember the battle, Ralph Waldo Emerson. And they asked Mr. Emerson to write a poem, for on that day they were going to erect a monument at the site of the battle. And so Emerson did indeed write a poem for the event, which is today inscribed on the monument that stands in Concord next to the bridge. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmer stood and fired the shot heard round the world. Emerson's poem, of course, actually a poem that was meant to be sung, is always, always remembered. It wasn't so long after that, on the eve of the American Civil War, that once again we reflected on our tradition and heritage. At Harvard College, there was a young man who taught modern languages, but we remember him as a poet. His name was Longfellow, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Longfellow was an ardent abolitionist. His best friend was Senator Sumner, Charles Sumner, the great abolitionist senator from Massachusetts. Longfellow himself was actually a descendant of a general, General Wadsworth, who had commanded Paul Revere during the American Revolution. Longfellow knew his history, particularly the history of the Revolution. On an afternoon, April the 5th, 1860, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow visited this church. He came with his friend, George Sumner, who was the senator's brother. Together they entered this chamber. They climbed the 15 stories to see the place where the lanterns had been displayed. The next day, Longfellow, in his study in Cambridge, began to write a poem about his visit here. But it was more than just about his visit here. It is, of course, the spring of 1860. America is on the verge of civil war. The nation is in crisis. Calamity is just around the corner. Longfellow came here and was inspired by the strength of the people of 1775, of their courage and their determination, their love of freedom and liberty. And he was determined to share that with his own generation. And he would do it through his poem. It took him a while to write it. And to be sure, the poem is not entirely accurate. But by December, he had finished the poem, and it was published in the Atlantic Monthly. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. We think of the poem as being a celebration of the Revolution. Yes, it was. But if we read the poem carefully, it's more than that. It's a call to arms. The poem was later, in 1863, collected in a series of essays and poems called Tales from the Wayside Inn. Longfellow was America's most popular poet in the 19th century. Everyone read Longfellow's poems, Evangeline, and Paul Revere, The Making of a Ship. And so Paul Revere's Ride became reading for everyone. And through that poem, millions of Americans learned about the Old North Church, about Paul Revere, and about the beginnings of the American Revolution. In 1875, we had our centennial, 100-year celebration. It was at that centennial celebration in 1875 that the town of Concord turned to a local sculptor, not yet famous, but he would be. His name was Daniel Chester French. They asked Mr. French, would he sculpt a statue of the Minuteman who stood at Northbridge? And he did. That statue stands today overlooking Northbridge. And of course, Daniel Chester French would later go on to sculpt another famous statue, the statue of Abraham Lincoln at the Lincoln Memorial. In 1975, we celebrated the bicentennial of the events of this church in Lexington and Concord. On that occasion, the President of the United States came to visit. He came to this church, and in remembrance and in honor of what happened here on the evening of April the 18th, 1775, he lit a third lantern to symbolize the ongoing devotion that Americans have to liberty, to freedom, and to the principles of the American Revolution. And so we have remembered these events for more than 200 years in statues, in poetry, and in celebrations. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church tower as a signal light. One if by land and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm. Then he said, good night, and with muffled oar silently rowed to the Charlestown shore. Just as the moon rose over the bay, where swinging wide at her moorings lay the Somerset British man of war, a phantom ship with each mast and spar across the moon like a prison bar, and a huge black hulk that was magnified by its own reflection in the tide. Meanwhile, his friend through alley and street wanders and watches with eager ears, till in the silence around him he hears the muster of men at the barrack door, the sound of arms and the tramp of feet, and the measured tread of the grenadiers, marching down to their boats on the shore. Then he climbed the tower of the Old North Church, by the wooden stairs with stealthy tread, to the belfry chamber overhead, and startled the pigeons from their perch on the somber rafters that round him made masses and moving shapes of shade. By the trembling ladder steep and tall, to the highest window in the wall, where he paused to listen and look down a moment on the roofs of the town and the moonlit flowing over all. Beneath in the churchyard lay the dead, in their night encampment on the hill, wrapped in silence so deep and still that he could hear like a sentinel's tread the watchful night wind as it went, creeping along from tent to tent and seeming to whisper, all is well. A moment only he feels the spell of the place and the hour and the secret dread of the lonely belfry and the dead. For suddenly all his thoughts are bent on a shadowy something far away, where the river widens to meet the bay, a line of black that bends and floats on the rising tide like a bridge of boats. Meanwhile, impatient to mount and ride, booted and spurred with a heavy stride. On the opposite shore walked Paul Revere. Now he patted his horse's side, how he gazed at the landscape far and near, then impetuous stamped the earth, and turned and tightened his saddle girth. But mostly he watched with eager search the belfry tower of the old North Church, as it rose above the graves on the hill, lonely and spectral and somber and still. And lo, as he looks on the belfry's height, a glimmer and then a gleam of light. He springs to the saddle, the bridle he turns, but lingers and gazes till full on his sight a second lamp in the belfry burns. A hurry of hoofs in a village street, a shape in the moonlight, a bulk in the dark, and beneath from the pebbles in passing a spark, struck out by steel, flying, fearless and fleet. That was all. And yet through the gloom and the light, the fate of a nation was riding that night. And the spark struck out by that steed in its flight kindled the land into flame with its heat. He has left the village and mounted the steep, and beneath him, tranquil, broad, and deep, is the mystic meeting the ocean's tide. And under the alders that skirt its edge, now soft in the sand, now loud on the edge, is heard the tramp of his steed as he rides. It was 12 by the village clock when he crossed the bridge into Medford town. He heard the crowing of the cock and the barking of the farmer's dog, and felt the damp of the river fog that rises after the sun goes down. It was 1 by the village clock when he galloped into Lexington. He saw the gilded weathercock swim in the moonlight as he passed, and the meeting-house windows, black and bare, gaze at him with a spectral glare, as if they already stood aghast at the bloody work they would look upon. It was 2 by the village clock when he came to the bridge in Concord town. He heard the bleating of the flock and the twitter of birds among the trees, and felt the breath of the morning breeze blowing over the meadow brown. And one was safe and asleep in his bed, who at the bridge would be first to fall, who that day would be lying dead, pierced by a British musket ball. You know the rest, in the books you have read, how the British regulars fired and fled, how the farmers gave them ball for ball from behind each fence and farmyard wall, chasing the redcoats down the lane, then crossing the fields to emerge again under the trees at the turn of the road, and only pausing to fire and load. So through the night rode Paul Revere, and so through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, a cry of defiance and not of fear, a voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore. For born on the night wind of the past, through all our history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. Longfellow was a poet, not an historian. And while his poem is probably the best known recounting of the events of April the 18th and 19th, there are some historical inaccuracies here. For example, the truth is that 2 men climbed up the belfry to display the lanterns, and Revere was not one of them. Nor is it true that Revere, when he went to Charlestown, looked back to see the signal from the church so that he would know how the British were coming. No, when he crossed the river, he already knew how the British were coming. There was no question to that. And he didn't ride to every Middlesex village and farm. He only made a few towns. And he was not alone. William Dawes was with him, certainly. He was the other rider. But there were many riders that night. Revere, the best remembered, to be sure. But there were many brave men who rode through that night to warn the other towns in Middlesex County. And then we have the matter of the clocks. Striking 1, striking 2. There were no clocks in those towns. There simply were no public clocks. And then perhaps one of the most interesting errors of all, you see, Paul Revere never finished his ride. He never got to Concord. He was captured by the British on the road between Lexington and Concord. So Longfellow was not free with the truth. he was certainly true to the spirit and true to recount the bravery of Paul Revere, who we might see as a symbol of all of the men who rode that night, of all the brave men who risked their lives to alert the countryside that the British are coming.